"Sir, before I authorize any work, I need to see how you're planning to actually pay for this." The shop manager said it loudly enough that two mechanics working nearby looked up from the vehicle they were servicing. Devin Marsh stood at the service counter of Redline Auto Repair with his 9-year-old son, Cole, beside him, having just described the grinding noise his transmission had been making for the past week. A noise that had gotten bad enough that morning that he had pulled over twice on the drive in. He wore a faded work jacket, the same one he wore most days, and he had mentioned, when asked, that he intended to pay out of pocket rather than through a service contract that had expired months earlier. The manager, a man named Gary Prentice, looked him over, glanced at Cole's scuffed sneakers, and decided, before running a single diagnostic, exactly what kind of customer he was dealing with. Cole, sensing the shift in his father's tone, even from across the small waiting area, looked up from his book with the particular alertness of a child who had learned to notice when adults' voices carried something other than their usual ease. "We've had people bring cars in here they can't actually afford to fix," Gary said, sliding the intake form back across the counter without finishing it. "I need to see a card or cash up front before my guys even pop the hood." What happened over the next 20 minutes would end with Gary standing in the middle of his own service bay with no explanation left to give. A longtime customer waiting nearby who recognized Devin's face from a night that had nearly cost her family everything. And every person in that garage learning exactly who they had just watched get treated like he couldn't be trusted. If stories like this keep you watching, subscribe, because there's more coming. Devin Marsh had spent 5 years rebuilding a civilian life around a set of skills most people around him never had reason to ask about. Working as a fleet maintenance technician for a regional trucking company, a job that used a fraction of what he had actually trained for, but paid steadily enough to keep his and Cole's life running on schedule. He had raised Cole alone since his wife's death, from complications during what should have been a routine surgery 3 years earlier, a loss that had rearranged nearly everything about how Devin approached the ordinary business of getting through a day. He was 36, wiry and quick with his hands in the specific way of someone who had spent years working under intense time pressure with equipment that did not forgive mistakes, and he carried a watchfulness that most people mistook for distraction, rather than the habit of constant mechanical assessment it actually was. He did not talk about the 8 years he had spent in the Army, 6 of those as a helicopter crew chief attached to a medevac unit, work that had required him to maintain and often repair aircraft under conditions that gave him minutes rather than hours to solve problems that would otherwise cost lives mid-flight. He had left the service 3 years before his wife's death, worn down less by any single incident than by the accumulated weight of watching too many close calls resolve in either direction, and had built a quieter life afterward that he had never regretted, even on days when the transition felt like trading something vital for something merely stable. He kept his old flight logs in a box in the garage, rarely opened but never discarded, alongside photographs of the aircraft and crews he had served alongside. Men and women scattered now across the country in lives Devin mostly only heard about through occasional messages. His fleet maintenance job suited him better than he had initially expected. The steady rhythm of scheduled maintenance and predictable diagnostics, offering a kind of professional calm he had not experienced during his years of emergency airborne repairs, though he sometimes missed the particular satisfaction of solving a problem that mattered as urgently as the ones he had once faced. He had turned down 2 promotions to shift supervisor over the years, specifically because the additional hours would have cut into evenings with Cole, a trade-off several colleagues found puzzling given the pay difference, and one Devin had never once reconsidered. He kept a small workbench in the garage where he taught Cole basic mechanical skills on weekends, not out of any expectation that his son would follow a similar path, but because he believed understanding how things worked, patiently and from first principles, was a form of confidence worth building early. Cole knew his father had been in the Army, the way children know facts about their parents without absorbing the full weight of them, and he knew Devin could fix almost anything mechanical with an ease that struck other adults as remarkable. And he knew his father never once raised his voice, not even the time Cole had accidentally backed the lawnmower into the shed door, trying to help with chores he was not quite tall enough to manage safely yet. Cole was quiet and observant in the particular way of a child raised by a father who modeled careful attention as the default response to most situations, and he had developed, without anyone teaching him to, an instinct for sensing when adults around him were being unfair that mirrored his father's own watchfulness in miniature. Their apartment carried the particular order of a household run by a methodical man learning to be both parents at once, a shared calendar on the refrigerator tracking Cole's school schedule and his own rotating shift assignments, a small shelf in the living room holding exactly one frame photograph of Cole's mother that Devin dusted every week without fail. He talked to Cole about her honestly when asked, without excessive elaboration, believing that avoiding hard truths taught children that difficult things were meant to be hidden rather than handled with care, and he coached Cole's youth baseball team in the spring, mostly because nobody else had volunteered, and Cole had asked with an earnestness that made refusing impossible. Their transmission trouble had started gradually, a faint whine that Devin had initially dismissed as something minor, easily explained by the truck's age and the miles he had put on it over the years. But by the morning of the appointment, it had progressed into a grinding noise, serious enough that he did not want to risk driving it any further than absolutely necessary. He had researched Redline Auto Repair online, a shop with decent reviews located a reasonable distance from their apartment, and scheduled an appointment for a Saturday morning, since Cole had no school, and there was no one else available to watch him. Devin dressed the way he dressed most days, worn work jacket, jeans, boots that had seen considerable use, because he saw no reason to dress differently for an errand that had nothing to do with anyone's opinion of him, and brought Cole along with a book to occupy himself during what he expected would be a straightforward diagnostic conversation, the kind he had handled dozens of times before, with his own trucking company's fleet. They arrived a few minutes early, Cole settling into one of the waiting area chairs with his book, while Devin approached the service counter to describe the problem. The grinding noise that had grown steadily worse over the course of the drive over, loud enough now that he had kept the radio off the entire way just to monitor it. Gary Prentice, the shop's manager, listened to his description of the grinding noise with the practiced patience of someone who had heard hundreds of similar complaints, taking notes on an intake form as Devin spoke. It was only when the conversation turned to payment and Devin mentioned that his service contract had lapsed and he would be paying directly that Gary's posture shifted, a recalibration Devin recognized immediately because he had encountered similar moments in contexts that had nothing to do with auto repair, moments where the specific fact of a person's appearance seemed to override every other piece of information available in the room. "We've had people bring cars in here they can't actually afford to fix," Gary said, sliding the partially completed intake form back across the counter. "I need to see a card or cash up front before my guys even pop the hood." Devin, genuinely confused, given that he had not yet been provided any estimate to actually fund, asked how he was meant to provide payment before knowing what the repair would even cost, a question that seemed, to him, like the most basic possible logic for anyone actually running a repair shop. Gary's expression did not soften. "Standard practice for cash customers," he said, in a tone that suggested this was neither standard nor particularly connected to any actual shop policy Devin could verify. The kind of phrase people reached for when they wanted a decision to sound procedural rather than personal. "I just need to know you're serious about this before I put my guys on it." Devin felt something tighten in his chest, the specific frustration of watching an assumption about his financial reliability presented as settled fact before any actual information had been exchanged. "I called ahead and scheduled this appointment," he said, his voice level despite the mounting irritation. "I've described the problem in detail. I haven't been given an estimate yet, and you're asking me to prove I can pay for a number neither of us has established. I'd like to understand what specifically about my description of this repair made you decide I couldn't cover it, especially since I mentioned the same details over the phone this morning without anyone raising a single concern at that point." Gary did not have a direct answer. Only the accumulated weight of an assumption formed the moment Devin mentioned paying out of pocket rather than through a contract, layered on top of whatever conclusions Gary had already drawn from his jacket and his boots before either of them said a word about payment at all. Cole, looking up from his book at the sound of his father's raised tension, though not his raised voice, watched the exchange with the same careful attention he brought to most uncertain situations. "Dad, is something wrong with the car?" he asked, more focused on the practical question than the interpersonal tension building at the counter, though clearly aware something about the adult's conversation had shifted. Devin glanced back at him, kept his voice warm, despite everything else happening. "We're just working through some details, buddy," he said. "Give me a minute." He turned back to Gary. "I'd like an actual estimate for the repair," he said. "And then we can discuss payment terms, once we both know what we're actually talking about. That's how this conversation is supposed to work." A woman waiting nearby, sitting with a coffee cup from the shop's small waiting area, had been listening to the exchange with growing discomfort, glancing between Devin, Cole, and Gary, with an expression that suggested her sympathies had settled firmly on one side of the counter. A mechanic near the open bay door, wiping his hands on a shop rag, had paused his own work, his attention drawn by the rising tension, though he had not yet said anything directly. A second customer, a younger man waiting to pick up his own vehicle, had also stopped scrolling on his phone, his attention caught by the specific tone of the exchange rather than its content at first, before the actual words began to register with him as well. Gary, sensing the shift in the room's attention, doubled down rather than reconsidering his position. "I've been doing this 15 years, he said. "I know which customers are actually going to follow through, and which ones are going to walk away from a bill they can't cover." Devin looked at him steadily. "Then ask me something specific that would actually verify that," he said. "Don't just assume it because of how I'm dressed, and refuse to even estimate the repair. Cole's transmission problem isn't going to get better while we debate whether I'm good for the cost of fixing it." The woman with the coffee cup finally spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Gary directly. "I brought my car here for 6 years. I've never once heard you require payment before even giving someone an estimate. What's different this time?" Gary glanced at her with visible irritation. "This isn't your concern," he said. She did not back down. "I'm sitting in this waiting room, watching you refuse basic service to a man with a legitimate car problem," she said. "That makes it my concern." The mechanic near the bay door added quietly, but audibly, "For what it's worth, I've never seen us ask for payment before diagnostics either. That's not actually how we do things here." The younger man with the phone, still listening, added his own observation, more hesitant but audible nonetheless. "I mean, he described the exact symptoms clearly. That's usually enough to at least start looking at it, right?" It was at this point that another customer, an older woman who had been standing near the parts counter waiting on her own vehicle, stepped closer, her attention fully absorbed by the confrontation, something shifting rapidly in her expression as she got a clearer look at Devin's face. She stopped a few feet away, staring, before finally speaking. "I know you," she said slowly, her voice carrying an uncertainty that made both Devin and Gary turn toward her. Devin looked at her, searching a face he did not immediately place among the many he had encountered over 8 years of service. 4 years ago," she said, her voice steadier now. "My husband was on a supply route that took mortar fire outside the wire. The bird that came to extract him and his unit took damage on the way in, hydraulics failing mid-flight, and the crew chief kept that helicopter together through the extraction and the flight back, working the whole way to keep systems functioning that should have failed completely. I remember getting the call telling me there'd been an incident and that he was being extracted, and then hours of not knowing anything else, just waiting by the phone for someone to tell me whether he was actually coming home." Devin felt something shift in his chest, an old memory surfacing before he consciously reached for it. Fragments of shuddering rotors and warning lights, and hands moving faster than conscious thought to keep an aircraft flying that had every mechanical reason to fail. They told me afterward that the crew chief never once said a word about how bad it actually was over the radio. She continued, her voice unsteady now. Kept everyone calm the entire flight, like it was routine, When the pilot told me afterward, it was the closest call he'd had in his whole career. My husband came home because that helicopter held together for 11 more minutes than anyone had a right to expect. I never got a name. Classified unit designations. Some policy about not releasing crew information outside official channels. I've told that story to anyone who'd listened for 4 years, and I never thought I'd actually meet the person in the middle of it, let alone in a place like this, on an ordinary Saturday morning. The garage had gone almost completely quiet around them. Gary's hand, still resting on the unfinished intake form, had gone still. The mechanic near the bay door had stopped working entirely. The younger man with the phone had lowered it slightly, caught somewhere between documenting the moment and simply absorbing it. Devin stood very still, the weight of that flight settling back over him in a way he had not expected on an ordinary Saturday morning car repair. "Staff Sergeant Devin Marsh," he said quietly. "Crew chief. Retired 3 years ago. That flight, I remember it. Hydraulics were failing faster than the manual said they should, and we were making decisions on the fly that weren't exactly textbook. But they held. And I think about that flight more than most people would probably guess, given how ordinary my life looks now." The woman crossed the remaining distance and gripped Devin's hand with both of hers, holding it a moment longer than a simple handshake required. "My husband's home safe today, watching our grandkids grow up," she said, her voice rough. "None of that happens without those 11 minutes you kept that aircraft together. I never thought I'd get the chance to actually thank the person who did it, and I certainly never expected it would happen while you were being accused of not being able to pay for a car repair." Gary stood behind the counter with the particular stillness of a man whose understanding of the last 20 minutes had just been completely restructured. He looked down at the unfinished intake form, at Cole watching from his chair, at the growing group of customers who had gathered near the counter, and something in his expression shifted from certainty into something considerably less comfortable. "I'd like an actual estimate for this repair," Devin said, turning back to him, his voice still even. "And I'd like to understand why describing a mechanical problem and mentioning I'd pay out of pocket was enough to make you require payment before you'd even diagnose it, when I've watched at least 2 other customers walk in this morning without facing anything close to that same scrutiny." Gary, visibly rattled, mentioned something about routine caution with unfamiliar customers. Devin pointed out that plenty of unfamiliar customers walked through that door every week without being asked to prepay for an undetermined repair, and asked what had actually made his situation different. Gary did not have a good answer, because there wasn't one. Only the accumulated weight of a judgment formed the moment he looked at Devin's jacket and decided, without asking a single clarifying question, that suspicion was the appropriate response, rather than the same basic courtesy he would likely have extended without hesitation to a customer who looked less like someone he had already decided to doubt. "I apologize," Gary said finally, the words arriving stiffly, a man unaccustomed to producing them without an audience forcing the issue. Devin looked at him for a long moment. "You should," he said. "Not because of anything you just heard about who I am. Because you refused basic service to a paying customer with a legitimate problem in front of my son before checking a single fact. That would have been wrong, no matter who was standing at this counter." Gary nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested the distinction had actually registered, even if it had taken an unlikely coincidence to make it land. Gary personally ran the diagnostic himself within minutes, the earlier resistance evaporating entirely once the actual conversation, rather than the assumption, finally took place. The transmission problem identified faster than the argument that had delayed it. The woman who had recognized Devin stayed nearby while the diagnostic completed, crouching slightly to speak with Cole, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide, careful eyes. "Your dad's a hero. You know that," she said gently. Cole nodded slowly, filing the words away with the seriousness he brought to most things. "I knew he used to fix helicopters," he said. "I didn't know it was like that." She smiled at him. "The bravest thing about him isn't just that flight," she said. "It's that he came home afterward and built a whole quiet life around taking care of you, and never once needed anybody to know the rest of it. That takes its own kind of strength." On the drive home, transmission repair scheduled for the following week once parts arrived, Cole was quiet for a while, working through something in the unhurried way he worked through most things. "Dad," he said eventually, "why didn't you just tell him what you used to do right away? It would have stopped faster." Devin glanced at him in the mirror. "Maybe," he said. But then, the lesson he'd have learned was that he was wrong to treat me that way because of what I did years ago. Not because it was already wrong before he knew anything about me at all. I want you to understand the difference, because only one of those is actually true. Cole considered this for a long moment, watching the passing buildings with the same careful attention he brought to most things his father told him. "So it's not about the helicopters," he said slowly. "It's about just treating people right, because they're people." Devin nodded. "That's exactly it," he said. Cole nodded back, satisfied, and then asked if they could get burgers on the way home to celebrate not having to walk anywhere for the rest of the weekend. Devin laughed, the sound loosening something in his chest that had been tight since the moment Gary first slid the intake form back across the counter. He thought about that morning often in the days that followed, not with anger, which had never been the feeling he carried longest, but with a plain, clear-eyed understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The shop's owner called him personally later that week, an apology delivered without an audience this time, along with confirmation that staff would be receiving retraining on customer intake procedures that did not rely on appearance-based judgments. The owner also mentioned that 2 other customers had reached out separately in the days following the incident, describing what they had witnessed and expressing concern about how the shop handled unfamiliar customers more broadly, a level of unsolicited feedback that Devin suspected had done more to prompt the retraining than his own complaint alone would have. Devin accepted the apology without making more of it than it was. What mattered more to him was quieter than any formal gesture. The fact that his son had watched him hold his ground calmly in a moment designed to make him feel untrustworthy, had watched a room full of strangers slowly recognize a truth that should never have needed recognizing in the first place, and had learned, without being told directly, that dignity was not something earned by revealing what he had once done. It was something owed simply for showing up as himself, description and history intact, asking for nothing more than a fair estimate and an honest conversation. He thought, too, about the woman whose husband he had helped bring home, about how strange and quietly moving it was that a single ordinary Saturday could contain both an accusation of dishonesty and an unexpected, overdue thank you from a stranger whose gratitude had been waiting 4 years for a place to land. He thought about his years in the cockpit less often than people might assume, but that morning had stirred something he had not examined closely in a while. The particular tension between the version of himself capable of extraordinary composure under genuine life-or-death pressure and the version of himself standing at a repair counter, being quietly accused of dishonesty over a transmission repair. He decided, driving home with Cole beside him, that both versions were simply the same man applying the same steady attention to whatever the moment actually required, and that the measure of his own character had less to do with which version people happened to witness, and more to do with whether he stayed consistent, regardless of which one they assumed they were looking at. Some mornings, the measure of a man is not the aircraft he once kept flying against every mechanical odd, but the quiet, steady patience he brings home to the one child, depending on him long after the last flight ended. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming.